the valleys, the prophet spoke words that would haunt generations. This thing is from me. God himself was tearing his own kingdom in two, but why? Imagine standing at Shechem on that fateful day, the air thick with tension, 180,000 warriors ready to march, families about to become mortal enemies. A young, foolish king utters one sentence that will unleash 2 centuries of bloodshed. 10 tribes scream their rebellion. One prophet tears his cloak into 12 pieces. Golden calves rise where God's altar should stand. And brothers who once worshipped together now plan each other's destruction. Here's what will chill you. This wasn't random chaos. This was prophesied, predetermined, ordained. The same God who promised Abraham a great nation was now dividing it with his own hands. Why would the Almighty orchestrate such devastation among his chosen people? What sin was so grave that it required a kingdom to bleed for generations? 500,000 men will die in a single day. Mothers will lose sons to their own cousins' arrows. The temple treasury will be stripped again and again to pay foreign armies. And through the smoke and screams, one question burns. Was this judgment, or was this mercy in disguise? The answer will shake everything you thought you knew about divine justice. Solomon sat on the throne of Israel at a time when the kingdom had never been greater. The borders stretched farther than they ever had before or would again. 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 21 tells us exactly how vast his territory was. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. This wasn't just political control. This was wealth beyond imagination. The same chapter in verse 26 describes his military might. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. These weren't just for show. They represented power that made neighboring nations think twice before causing trouble. The palace complex in Jerusalem became the envy of the ancient world. It took 13 years to complete, and when it was finished, nothing compared to it. But even more impressive was the temple Solomon built for God. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 38 marks its completion. In the 11th year, in the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished in all its details according to its specifications. He had spent 7 years building it. When the Queen of Sheba heard about Solomon's wisdom and wealth, she had to see it for herself. She came with hard questions and expensive gifts. What she found left her breathless. 1 Kings chapter 10 verses 6 and 7 record her reaction. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard." The gold alone was staggering. Verse 14 of that same chapter states, "The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 6,666 talents. That's roughly 25 tons of gold every single year, not counting what came from merchants and traders. Solomon made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, according to verse 27. The city gleamed with prosperity. Kings and rulers from every nation sent representatives to hear Solomon's wisdom. 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 34 says, "From all nations people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom." Israel had become the center of the known world, the place where wisdom, wealth, and divine blessing converged. Everything seemed perfect. The nation was at peace. The temple stood magnificent on Mount Moriah. Trade routes brought endless wealth. Solomon's wisdom was celebrated everywhere. But underneath this golden surface, cracks were already forming. The very policies that built this empire were creating resentment that would one day explode into civil war. All those buildings, all that gold, all those horses and chariots, they didn't appear out of nowhere. Someone had to do the work. Someone had to quarry the stones, cut the timber, haul the materials, and spend years constructing these monuments. That someone was the people of Israel. 1 Kings chapter 5 describes the massive workforce Solomon assembled. Verse 13 states, King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. These weren't volunteers. These were men forced to leave their families, their fields, and their livelihoods to serve the king's building projects. The system worked in shifts. Verse 14 explains, he sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor, 1 month away, 2 months home. It sounds reasonable until you realize this went on for years. Farmers missed planting seasons. Shepherds left their flocks. Craftsmen abandoned their shops. But it wasn't just the 30,000 sent to Lebanon. Verse 15 adds more numbers. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills. That's 150,000 more men doing backbreaking labor in the quarries and on the construction sites. These workers cut massive stones for the temple foundation, some of them weighing several tons. 1 Kings chapter 9 gives us even more detail about Solomon's building program. Verses 17 through 19 list project after project. Solomon rebuilt Giza. He built up Lower Beth Horon, Baalath and Tadmor in the desert within his land, as well as all his store cities and the towns for his chariots and for his horses, whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and throughout all the territory he ruled. Every single one of these construction projects required men, lots of men who would rather be home. And here's what made it worse. The burden didn't fall equally on everyone. The northern tribes, the territories that had once belonged to the ancient tribal lands of Ephraim, Manasseh, and the others, they bore the heaviest load. Chapter 11, verse 28 mentions a man who would become important to our story. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the tribes of Joseph. The tribes of Joseph, that's Ephraim and Manasseh, the heart of the northern territory. Solomon had appointed someone to squeeze even more work out of them. Month after month, year after year, men from the north left their homes. They hauled timber from Lebanon. They cut stones in the quarries. They built cities they would never live in, and palaces they would never enter. Their muscles ached, their families struggled, and slowly, quietly, anger built in their hearts. The kingdom looked glorious from the outside, but for the common man, especially in the north, Solomon's glory came at a painful price. They were building an empire, yes, but they were also building resentment that would outlast the buildings themselves. The labor was only part of the burden. Solomon's court needed to eat, his officials needed salaries, his building projects needed materials, his trading expeditions needed funding. All of that required taxes. Lots of taxes. 1 Kings chapter 4 lays out Solomon's administrative system in detail. Verse 7 introduces it simply. Solomon had 12 district governors over all Israel, who supplied provisions for the king and the royal household. Each one had to provide supplies for 1 month in the year. 12 districts, 12 governors, each responsible for 1 month. Verses 8 through 19 list each governor by name and territory. But here's what matters. Look carefully at that list and you'll notice something. Judah isn't included in the 12 districts. Solomon's own tribe, the southern kingdom's heartland, wasn't in the rotation. The northern tribes carried the full weight of feeding the royal court, and what an appetite that court had. Verses 22 and 23 describe a single day's provisions. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 kor of the finest flour and 60 kors of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. Do the math. 30 kors of fine flour is about 6,600 pounds of the expensive stuff. 60 kors of regular meal is over 13,000 pounds. 10 fattened cattle, 20 range cattle, 100 sheep and goats, plus wild game and fancy birds, every single day. For 1 month each year, Each district had to provide this. Month after month, the wagons rolled into Jerusalem loaded with grain and meat and wine, while the families back home tightened their belts. Verse 25 paints a picture of peace and prosperity. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. But this verse hides attention. Yes, there was safety. Yes, there was peace. But everyone under their own vine and fig tree applied much more comfortably to Judah than to the northern tribes who were funding the whole operation. The system wasn't just about food. Verse 26 reminds us, Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. Those horses needed grain. Verse 28 specifies, they also brought to the proper place their quotas of barley and straw for the chariot horses and the other horses. More wagons, more grain, more demands on the northern districts. Each district governor had to make it happen. They had to collect from farmers who might have had a bad harvest. They had to requisition animals from shepherds who couldn't afford to lose them. They had to keep the supply lines moving to Jerusalem or face the king's displeasure. The weight of it all pressed down harder each year. And always there was the reminder that Judah didn't share this burden. The men of Ephraim and Manasseh noticed, the farmers of Issachar and Zebulun noticed, the herders of Naphtali and Asher noticed. Why should they bear what Judah didn't have to carry? The tax collectors came regularly, their demands never decreasing. The barns emptied to feed Jerusalem. The herds shrank to supply the royal table. And in the homes of the northern tribes, parents looked at their children and wondered why Solomon's wisdom didn't include fairness in taxation. This wasn't just money or food, this was justice, or the lack of it. And when justice feels absent, loyalty starts to crack. Solomon's political genius included strategic marriages. Want an alliance with Egypt? Marry Pharaoh's daughter. Need peace with the Moabites? Take a Moabite princess. Trying to secure trade routes through Edom? An Edomite wife helps. It was brilliant diplomacy. It was also spiritual disaster. 1 Kings chapter 11 opens with the ugly truth. Verse 1 doesn't sugarcoat it. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. The list reads like a catalogue of Israel's ancient enemies, the very nations God had warned them about. Verse 2 reminds us why this mattered. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. God had been clear. Moses had warned them, but Solomon loved them anyway. The numbers are shocking. Verse 3 gives the count. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. 1,000 women, each one bringing her own gods, her own priests, her own religious practices. The palace became a religious marketplace. These weren't quiet, private beliefs. Verse 4 describes what happened as Solomon aged. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. The man who built God's temple was now bowing to other deities. Verse 5 names them specifically. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Ashtoreth, the goddess of sexuality and war. Molech, the god who demanded child sacrifice. Solomon wasn't just tolerating these religions, he was following them. It got worse. Verse 7 describes construction projects that rivaled the temple itself. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. These weren't hidden shrines. They were on a hill where everyone could see them, right across the valley from God's temple. Verse 8 extends the horror. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Multiple high places, multiple altars, multiple priesthoods, all operating with the king's blessing and funding. The man whom God had blessed with wisdom beyond measure was now spreading idolatry throughout his kingdom. Think about what the people saw. They looked at Mount Moriah and saw the temple their fathers had built, where sacrifices to Yahweh rose daily. Then they looked across the Kidron Valley and saw smoke rising from altars to Chemosh and Molech and Ashtoreth. Their king, David's son, the wisest man alive, was hedging his bets with foreign gods. The spiritual confusion filtered down through the nation. If the king worshipped at multiple altars, why shouldn't they? If foreign gods deserved high places, maybe they had power too. The clarity that had marked David's reign was replaced by religious compromise. The nation that had been called to be holy, separate, devoted to one God alone, was now just another polytheistic kingdom. The temple still stood. The priests still offered sacrifices. The festivals still happened. But something essential had been corrupted. Solomon had traded spiritual purity for political convenience, and God was watching. God's patience had limits. Solomon's idolatry couldn't continue without consequences. The judgment would come through a prophet named Ahijah from Shiloh, and it would be delivered to an unlikely recipient, a labor foreman named Jeroboam. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 29 sets the scene. About that time Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah the prophet of Shiloh met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country. This wasn't a public confrontation. This was a private encounter on a deserted road, the kind of moment that changes history. Verse 30 describes what happened next. And Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Imagine watching this, a respected prophet suddenly grabbing his own new garment and ripping it apart. This wasn't symbolic. This was shocking, violent, deliberate. Then came the interpretation. Verse 31, Then he said to Jeroboam, Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. 10 pieces of cloth, 10 tribes. The math was simple and devastating, but why? God explained through Ahijah. Verses 32 and 33 lay out the reasons. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David, Solomon's father, did. Notice the language. They have forsaken me, not just Solomon. The nation had followed him into idolatry. The worship of Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Molech had spread beyond the royal family. The spiritual rot went deep. Verse 34 contains both judgment and mercy. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose, and who obeyed my commands and decrees. Solomon would keep his throne until death, for David's sake, not Solomon's. The promise to Jeroboam continued. Verse 37 and 38 offered him something remarkable. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you and walk in obedience to me and do what is right in my eyes by obeying my decrees and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. An enduring dynasty. The same promise given to David. All Jeroboam had to do was obey. The condition was clear. The opportunity was incredible. This labor foreman, this manager of conscripted workers, would become king over 10 tribes. Verse 39 adds one final note. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. The punishment had an end date. The division wouldn't last eternally. But for now, for generations to come, the kingdom would be torn in two. Jeroboam stood on that empty road, holding 10 pieces of cloth, his mind reeling. A prophet had just told him he would be king. God himself had decreed it. The united kingdom of David and Solomon was finished. The question was no longer if it would split, but when. Solomon heard about Ahijah's prophecy. How he found out, Scripture doesn't say. Maybe someone saw the encounter. Maybe Jeroboam told someone he shouldn't have trusted. Maybe the prophet himself spoke publicly. However it happened, the king learned that God had promised his kingdom to one of his own officials. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 40 tells us Solomon's response. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death. The wisest man in the world responded with simple violence. Kill the threat. Eliminate the problem. The same Solomon who had once judged between two mothers with brilliant insight now saw murder as the solution. But Jeroboam was smart. He didn't wait around. He didn't try to negotiate. He didn't gather followers for a rebellion. He ran. He fled south, past Judah, past the Negev, into Egypt, putting hundreds of miles between himself and Solomon's assassins. Egypt was the perfect refuge. It was powerful enough that Solomon couldn't simply demand extradition. It was close enough that Jeroboam could keep track of events back home. And Shishak the Pharaoh had his own reasons to harbor an enemy of Solomon. A divided Israel would be a weakened Israel, and a weakened Israel served Egypt's interests. We don't know much about Jeroboam's years in Egypt. 1 Kings doesn't tell us if he lived in the palace or in a common house. We don't know if he learned Egyptian ways or kept to his Israelite customs. We don't know if he was honored as a political refugee or watched carefully as a potential troublemaker. But we know he waited. Day after day, month after month, year after year in a foreign land. He couldn't go home. He couldn't claim his promised throne. He couldn't do anything except survive and remember what the prophet had said. God would give him 10 tribes. God would make him king. But not yet. Not while Solomon lived. Think about those years from Jeroboam's perspective. A prophet had spoken God's word to him directly. He had been promised a kingdom, but instead of a crown, he got exile. Instead of a throne, he got a foreign land where he couldn't even speak the language at first. Instead of ruling, he was running for his life. Did he doubt? Did he wonder if Ahijah had been wrong? Did he question whether God's promise would actually come true? Scripture doesn't say. It just tells us he stayed in Egypt until Solomon died. He waited for God's timing. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Solomon ruled on. The forced labor continued. The taxes kept flowing. The foreign altars still smoked with incense. The kingdom looked stable on the surface. But in reality, everyone was waiting. The king was aging. The people were restless. And in Egypt, the man God had chosen to tear the kingdom apart was biding his time. The kingdom's days were numbered. Solomon's policies had created the pressure. His idolatry had triggered divine judgment. His attempt to kill Jeroboam had driven away the very man who would fulfill God's prophecy. All the pieces were in place. Only Solomon's death stood between the present and the catastrophe to come. The years caught up with Solomon. Age diminished the sharp mind that had once amazed the Queen of Sheba. The body that had overseen massive building projects grew weak. The king who had ruled for 4 decades faced the one enemy his wisdom couldn't outwit: death itself. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 42 records the end simply. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. 40 years of glory, 40 years of building, 40 years of wealth, 40 years that began with divine blessing and ended with divine judgment. Verse 43 states the conclusion. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king. No dramatic final words are recorded. No deathbed repentance is mentioned. Solomon simply died and was buried with his fathers in Jerusalem. Think about what Solomon left behind. The temple still stood magnificent on its platform. The palace complex sprawled across Jerusalem. Store cities dotted the landscape. Fortifications protected the borders. The treasury held wealth beyond counting. By any measure, he had been successful. But success had come at a price. The northern tribes groaned under forced labor. Tax districts bled the people dry while Judah watched from the sidelines. Foreign altars polluted the land. God's prophet had already pronounced doom on the kingdom. And in Egypt, Jeroboam waited for news of the king's death. Rehoboam stepped into his father's shoes. He was 41 years old, according to 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 21. Old enough to have watched his father's policies for years. Old enough to understand how the kingdom worked. Old enough to know about the tensions simmering beneath the surface. But being old enough to know something and being wise enough to handle it are different things. Rehoboam had grown up in the palace, surrounded by luxury. He had seen the tribute flow in. He had watched foreign delegations bow before his father. He had lived his entire life at the center of power. What he hadn't experienced was the life of a farmer in Ephraim who lost his sons to labor duty every few months. He hadn't felt the frustration of a merchant in Manasseh who paid taxes that Judah didn't carry. He hadn't stood in the northern territories and sensed the anger building against Jerusalem. Solomon's death changed everything. The old king was gone. The promises God made to David's line still stood, but the promise to split the kingdom also remained unfulfilled. Rehoboam held the crown, but his grip on the northern tribes was already slipping before he even realized it. The people weren't going to automatically accept the new king just because he was Solomon's son. They had questions, they had demands, they had decades of resentment ready to spill out, and they had a place in mind for this confrontation. Not Jerusalem, where Rehoboam could surround himself with Judah's support, but Shechem in the north. Solomon's funeral was barely over before the real crisis began. The kingdom looked stable. The succession seemed secure. But underneath, everything was about to explode. Rehoboam faced his first test as king, but it wouldn't happen in Jerusalem. The northern tribes sent word, if Rehoboam wanted their allegiance, he needed to come to them. Come to Shechem, come north, and they had someone they wanted him to meet. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 1 sets the stage. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. This location wasn't random. Shechem carried deep meaning. Abraham had built an altar there. Jacob had bought land there. Joshua had gathered the tribes there for covenant renewal. It was neutral ground between north and south, a place where Israel's tribal identity ran deeper than Jerusalem's royal politics. But there was a bigger issue. Verse 2 introduces it. When Jeroboam son of Nebat heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. The exile was over. The man God had promised to make king was back, and the northern tribes had invited him. Verse 3 makes clear this wasn't a one-man mission. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, this was official, organized. The northern tribes had a spokesman, and they had chosen the one man Solomon had tried to kill, the one man a prophet had said would rule 10 tribes. The moment had arrived. Rehoboam stood before the northern tribes at Shechem, the ancient covenant site. Jeroboam stood with them, representing their interests and their demands. The whole assembly waited. Would the new king listen? Would he understand what his father's policies had cost them? Everything that happened next, the division of the kingdom, the wars, the bloodshed, the centuries of conflict, all of it hinged on what would happen in this assembly. The seeds Solomon had planted were about to sprout. The kingdom David had built was one decision away from shattering. Rehoboam had been king for weeks at most. He held all the power. He had the army, the treasury, the palace, the temple. But standing at Shechem, facing the northern tribes with Jeroboam among them, his power wasn't quite as solid as it looked. The northern tribes had come, yes, but they had come with expectations, and they were about to make those expectations very, very clear. The assembly at Shechem wasn't just a formality. The northern tribes had come with a clear agenda, and they had chosen their spokesman carefully. Jeroboam stood before Rehoboam, backed by the whole assembly of Israel, ready to voice what generations had been thinking. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 4 records their petition, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." Simple, direct, a straightforward deal. Reduce the burden, and you'll have our loyalty. The request wasn't asking for much. They weren't demanding independence. They weren't rejecting the house of David. They were simply asking for relief. Years of forced labor had worn them down. Decades of unfair taxation had drained their resources. They wanted a lighter load. In exchange, they promised to serve the new king. Notice the condition in their words, "We will serve you." They were offering allegiance, but it wasn't automatic. It was conditional. Rehoboam had to earn their loyalty by showing them basic fairness. The northern tribes were essentially saying, "We're willing to follow you, but not under the same crushing weight your father put on us." This was Jeroboam's first public appearance since returning from Egypt. He wasn't claiming the throne yet. He wasn't stirring up rebellion. He was simply speaking for the people, expressing their legitimate grievances. The prophet had promised him 10 tribes, but he wasn't forcing it. He was letting the situation unfold. Think about the position Rehoboam was in. He could start his reign with unity. All he had to do was show compassion, reduce the labor requirements, adjust the tax system, and the northern tribes would rally behind him. Or he could assert his authority, insist on maintaining his father's policies, and risk alienating half the kingdom. The choice seemed obvious. Any wise leader would choose unity over stubbornness. Any smart king would recognize that small concessions now could prevent massive problems later. But Rehoboam was about to show that being Solomon's son didn't mean inheriting Solomon's wisdom. Rehoboam didn't give an immediate answer. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 5 shows he asked for time. Rehoboam answered, "Go away for 3 days and then come back to me." So the people went away. 3 days to think, 3 days to consult advisors, 3 days to make the most important decision of his new reign. He went first to the people who knew his father best. Verse 6 tells us, "Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. 'How would you advise me to answer these people?' he asked. These weren't young men. These were experienced administrators who had watched Solomon's policies create this tension. Their advice was clear and practical. Verse 7 records their counsel. They replied, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." Notice their logic. Serve them now and they'll serve you forever. Show compassion today and you'll gain loyalty for life. This was wisdom speaking. These elders understood something fundamental about leadership. Sometimes the strongest position is the humble one. They weren't suggesting Rehoboam abandon his authority. They were advising him to use his authority wisely. Meet the people's needs, and the people will meet yours. But Rehoboam wasn't satisfied with this advice. Verse 8 shows his next move. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He turned from experience to youth, from wisdom to arrogance. These young advisors were Rehoboam's age. They had grown up in the palace alongside him. They had never worked in the fields. They had never been conscripted for labor duty. They had never struggled under heavy taxes. They lived in a bubble of privilege and power. Rehoboam asked them the same question in verse 9. What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? He presented the situation exactly as it was. The people want relief. What should I do? The young men's answer was the opposite of the elders' wisdom. Verses 10 and 11 record their counsel. The young men who had grown up with him replied, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. This was more than bad advice. This was contempt. The young advisors were telling Rehoboam to mock the people's suffering. Don't just refuse their request. Insult them. Don't just maintain the status quo. Threaten to make it worse. Show them who's boss. Assert dominance. Make them fear you. The metaphor they suggested was deliberately insulting. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist was a crude boast about strength and virility. Scorpions referred to whips embedded with metal barbs that tore flesh. The young men were advising Rehoboam to threaten the people with torture. Rehoboam had two completely different counsels before him. The elders said, humble yourself and gain loyalty. The young men said, threaten them and demand submission. Experience said, serve. Youth said, dominate. Wisdom said, unite. Arrogance said, intimidate. The 3 days passed. The northern tribes returned to Shechem, waiting for the king's answer. Jeroboam stood among them. The whole assembly gathered. Rehoboam prepared to speak, and the future of the kingdom hung on which advisors he had chosen to follow. The northern tribes stood before Rehoboam, waiting for his response. 3 days had given them hope. Surely the new king would be reasonable. Surely he would see that easing their burden would strengthen his reign. They had asked for so little. Now they would hear whether their new king had wisdom or pride. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 12 sets the scene. 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, as the king had said, come back to me in 3 days. They came back as requested. They were following protocol. They were giving Rehoboam respect. They were hoping for good news. What they got instead was a slap in the face. Verse 13 describes Rehoboam's demeanor. The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. He had made his choice. He had listened to the young men instead of the experienced counselors, and now he was about to destroy his own kingdom. Verse 14 records the actual words. He followed the advice of the young men and said, my father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Word for word, exactly what the young advisors had suggested. The insult, the threat, the mockery of their suffering. Can you imagine the shock? These men had come asking for relief from years of forced labor and crushing taxes. They had offered their loyalty in exchange, and the king's response was to threaten them with worse treatment. He didn't just say no, he mocked them. He promised to increase their pain. But something bigger was happening here. Verse 15 reveals the hidden hand behind these events. So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. God was orchestrating this disaster. Rehoboam's foolishness was fulfilling divine prophecy. This doesn't excuse Rehoboam's cruelty. He made his own choice to ignore wise counsel. He chose arrogance over humility. He picked intimidation over compassion. But his bad choice became the instrument of God's judgment on Solomon's idolatry. The kingdom that Solomon had corrupted with foreign gods was now being torn apart through Solomon's son's stupidity. The northern tribes heard Rehoboam's answer. They looked at each other. They looked at Jeroboam. They looked back at the young king who had just threatened them with scorpions. And something broke. Years of resentment crystallized into rebellion in that single moment. The heavy yoke wasn't going to get lighter. The unfair taxes weren't going to change. The forced labor would continue, maybe even worse. Rehoboam had been given a choice between unity and division. He chose division. He had been offered loyalty in exchange for fairness. He rejected the deal. He had 3 days to choose wisdom. He chose foolishness instead. And with those words, "I will scourge you with scorpions," he became the king who split God's kingdom in two. The northern tribes didn't need to discuss their response. Rehoboam's words had made the decision for them. If the new king wouldn't listen to reasonable requests, if he would mock their suffering and threaten worse treatment, then why should they serve him at all? 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 16 captures the moment of rebellion. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So the Israelites went home. What share do we have in David? This wasn't a new question. These same words had been shouted generations earlier during Sheba's rebellion in 2 Samuel chapter 20. It was an old battle cry, a rejection of Judah's dominance, a declaration of northern independence. The northern tribes were saying they owed nothing to David's family. "To your tents, Israel," was a command to go home, to abandon Rehoboam, to return to their own territories. They weren't just walking away disappointed. They were walking away done, finished, through with the house of David. If Rehoboam wanted to rule, he could rule Judah. The north was leaving. The assembly at Shechem dissolved. Men from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, Asher, Dan, all the northern tribes, they turned their backs on Rehoboam and headed home. The coronation that was supposed to unite the kingdom had instead fractured it beyond repair. But Rehoboam still didn't understand what he had done. He still thought he could control the situation through force. Verse 18 shows his next disastrous decision. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. Of all the officials Rehoboam could have sent, he chose Adoniram, the man who symbolized everything the northern tribes hated. Adoniram was the overseer of forced labor, the face of their oppression, the man who had conscripted their sons and husbands for Solomon's projects. Sending him was like pouring gasoline on a fire. The northern tribes' response was immediate and violent. They stoned Adoniram to death. This wasn't a random mob action. This was execution. They were killing the symbol of their oppression, making clear that the old system was dead, and anyone who tried to enforce it would die too. Rehoboam finally grasped the danger he was in. He wasn't safe in Shechem anymore. The northern tribes weren't just walking away. They were ready to kill anyone associated with his regime. He ran for his chariot and raced back to Jerusalem, probably wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Verse 19 summarizes the catastrophe. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. This wasn't a temporary disagreement. This wasn't a protest that could be smoothed over with negotiations. This was permanent separation. The northern tribes had rejected David's dynasty completely. Rehoboam had arrived at Shechem as king over all Israel. He left as king over only Judah and Benjamin. In the span of 3 days, he had lost 10 tribes through his own arrogance. The united kingdom was finished. What David had built and Solomon had maintained was now shattered. And it had happened because a young king listened to young fools instead of wise elders. With Rehoboam fled to Jerusalem and the northern tribes having rejected David's house, someone needed to step into the leadership vacuum. The northern tribes knew exactly who they wanted. The man God had promised a kingdom was about to receive it. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 20 describes what happened next. When all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. Notice the process. They didn't just declare Jeroboam king on their own. They called an assembly. This was official, deliberate, organized. The northern tribes were establishing a legitimate government, not just staging a rebellion. They were forming a new nation. Jeroboam's coronation fulfilled Ahijah's prophecy exactly. The prophet had torn his cloak into 12 pieces and given Jeroboam 10. Now 10 tribes had given themselves to Jeroboam. God's word through Ahijah had come true. The kingdom was divided just as predicted, but notice what the verse says about Judah. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. Notice what about Benjamin? 2 Chronicles chapter 11 verse 1 clarifies, when Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered Judah and Benjamin, 180,000 able young men, to go to war against Israel and to regain the kingdom for Rehoboam. So Benjamin stayed with Judah, but they were so small and so close to Jerusalem that they barely counted as separate. The division was complete, 10 tribes in the north under Jeroboam, 2 tribes in the south under Rehoboam. The northern kingdom kept the name Israel. The southern kingdom became known as Judah, 2 nations where there had been one, 2 kings where David's line had ruled alone, 2 kingdoms that would now compete, clash, and sometimes go to war. Jeroboam established his capital at Shechem, the very place where Rehoboam had destroyed his own kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 25 tells us, Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built up Peniel. He was building infrastructure, establishing defenses, creating a government. The northern kingdom was larger in territory and population. They controlled the fertile valleys and important trade routes. They had more tribes, more soldiers, more resources. On paper, Israel looked stronger than Judah. But Israel had a problem that Judah didn't have. Jerusalem was in Judah, the temple was in Judah, God's altar was in Judah. Every major festival required pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The religious center of the entire nation was in Rehoboam's territory, not Jeroboam's. Jeroboam had received the kingdom God promised him. He ruled over 10 tribes. He had a capital city and administrative structure. He had legitimacy from the people and prophecy from God. But he also had a crisis that would define his entire reign and doom his dynasty. And that crisis was about to drive him to make a decision that would corrupt his kingdom from the very beginning. Rehoboam sat in Jerusalem, humiliated and angry. He had lost 10 tribes in a matter of days. His authority had been rejected. His official had been stoned to death. The kingdom his father and grandfather built was now split in 2. He wasn't going to accept this quietly. 2 Chronicles chapter 11 verse 1 describes his response. When Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered Judah and Benjamin, 180,000 able young men, to go to war against Israel and to regain the kingdom for Rehoboam. 180,000 soldiers. This was serious. Rehoboam was preparing to force the northern tribes back under his control. This was civil war, brother against brother, Israelite against Israelite. The same people who had stood together at Sinai, who had crossed the Jordan together, who had worshipped together at the temple, now they were about to kill each other over which king to follow. The army assembled, officers gave orders, weapons were distributed, routes were planned. Judah and Benjamin were about to march north and drench the land in blood. But before a single soldier crossed the border, God intervened. Verse 2 introduces the prophet, but this word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. God sent a message through one of his prophets, just as he had sent the division prophecy through Ahijah. The same God who had torn the kingdom apart was now preventing the war to reunify it. Verse 3 identifies the audience. Say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all Israel in Judah and Benjamin. This message was for everyone. The king, the soldiers, the people. Everyone needed to hear what God was about to say. Verse 4 delivers the command. This is what the Lord says. Do not go up to fight against your fellow Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. The message was clear and direct. Don't fight. Go home. This division isn't an accident. It's God's plan. This is my doing. Those 4 words explained everything. Rehoboam's foolishness at Shechem wasn't just bad luck. The northern tribe's rebellion wasn't just political frustration. The whole situation was orchestrated by God as judgment on Solomon's idolatry. Fighting against it meant fighting against God. The command continued, so they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home again as the Lord had ordered. This is remarkable. 180,000 soldiers, assembled and ready for war, simply went home. Rehoboam wanted his kingdom back. His commanders wanted military glory. The soldiers were prepared to fight. But they all heard God's word through the prophet and obeyed. Think about what this prevented. If Judah had marched north, thousands would have died. Cities would have been destroyed. Families would have been torn apart. The bitterness would have run so deep that reconciliation might never have been possible. God stopped the war before it started. But God stopping the war didn't mean the 2 kingdoms would be at peace. Verse 1 of 1 Kings chapter 14 states, there was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. They didn't have one big battle, but they had constant skirmishes, raids, border disputes. The relationship between Israel and Judah would be hostile for generations. The aborted war showed something important. God had divided the kingdom, and God wasn't going to let Rehoboam undo it by force. The split was permanent. The northern tribes were now Israel. The southern tribes were now Judah. And both kingdoms needed to accept this new reality and figure out how to live with it. Jeroboam had everything he had been promised. He was king over 10 tribes. He had a functioning government. His people had chosen him freely. God's prophet had declared him the rightful ruler. But as he sat in his palace at Shechem, a dangerous thought kept returning to his mind. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 26 reveals his fear. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. Despite everything that had happened, despite God's prophecy, despite the people's choice, Jeroboam was afraid he would lose what he had gained. Verse 27 shows his reasoning. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. This was his crisis. The law required Israelites to worship at Jerusalem 3 times a year, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Every major festival would pull his people south into enemy territory. Think about what Jeroboam was imagining. His citizens traveling to Jerusalem, seeing the temple in its glory, participating in the festivals, rubbing shoulders with people from Judah. Over time, the old loyalties might revive. The old connections might strengthen. They might start thinking, why are we following Jeroboam when God's house is here with David's line? Jeroboam's fear wasn't completely irrational. Jerusalem held powerful emotional and spiritual appeal. The temple was magnificent. The Davidic line had divine promises. The religious and political centers being in Rehoboam's territory did create a long-term problem for the northern kingdom's stability. But here's what Jeroboam forgot. God had given him the kingdom. God had promised through Ahijah that if Jeroboam obeyed God's commands and walked in his ways, God would build him a dynasty as enduring as David's. The solution to Jeroboam's fear was simple: trust God and obey God's law. Instead, Jeroboam chose political calculation over faith. He decided to solve a spiritual problem with a political solution. He would create an alternative religious system that would keep his people in the north. He would give them a substitute for Jerusalem so they wouldn't need to travel south. Verse 28 shows his decision. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. Notice he sought advice. He didn't make this decision alone. He consulted with advisors, probably priests and officials, working out how to create a rival religious system. But the moment he decided to make golden calves, he crossed a line. He knew the history. Every Israelite knew the story of Aaron and the golden calf at Mount Sinai. They knew how that had nearly destroyed the nation. They knew God's fury at that idolatry. Yet Jeroboam deliberately chose the same symbol for his substitute worship. Jeroboam faced a crisis of faith. He could trust God's promise and maintain proper worship, accepting the political risk. Or he could trust his own wisdom and create a new system, corrupting worship to secure his throne. He chose his throne over God's commands, and that choice would poison his entire dynasty. Jeroboam's golden calves were ready. Now he needed to sell the idea to his people. He needed to make this religious innovation seem legitimate, even appealing. He needed them to stop thinking about Jerusalem and start worshipping in the north. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 28 records his announcement. He said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Notice the manipulation. First, he appeals to convenience. Jerusalem is too far, the trip is too hard. Second, he uses the exact words Aaron had used at Sinai. Here are your gods who brought you up out of Egypt. By using Aaron's words, Jeroboam was trying to connect his calves to that ancient event. But he was connecting to the wrong part of the story. Aaron's golden calf had nearly resulted in God destroying the entire nation. Moses had to intercede desperately to prevent it. 3,000 men died that day for worshipping the calf. This wasn't a precedent to repeat. It was a warning to avoid. Verse 29 describes the locations. One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan. This was strategic. Bethel was in the south of the northern kingdom, close to the border with Judah. Anyone thinking about traveling to Jerusalem could stop at Bethel instead. Dan was in the far north. Together, these 2 sites bookended the kingdom. From Dan to Beersheba had been the traditional phrase describing Israel's extent. Now Jeroboam had a calf at Dan in the north and another at Bethel, replacing Beersheba in the south. He was creating a rival geography of worship to compete with Jerusalem, but the calves weren't the only innovation. Verse 30 adds a prophetic comment, "And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other." The writer of Kings is making clear this wasn't just a political move. This was sin. This was idolatry. The people embraced it, but that didn't make it right. Jeroboam went further. Verse 31 says, Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. He was completely rewriting the religious system. God's law specified that only descendants of Aaron could serve as priests. Only Levites could handle temple duties. Jeroboam ignored all of that. He appointed priests from any tribe. If someone wanted to be a priest, fine. No qualifications needed, no legitimate ordination required. This wasn't just creating an alternative to Jerusalem, it was creating an alternative to God's entire system of worship. Verse 32 describes the final innovation. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel he also installed priests at the high places he had made. He created his own festival calendar. The real Festival of Tabernacles happened in the 7th month. Jeroboam moved it to the 8th month. Why change the calendar? To make sure his people weren't traveling to Jerusalem for the real festivals. If they were celebrating in the 8th month at Bethel or Dan, they wouldn't be in Jerusalem for the 7th month celebration. He was deliberately pulling them away from God's appointed times. Verse 33 emphasizes Jeroboam's personal involvement. On the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. This was his own idea, his own timing, his own system, and he personally participated, giving royal approval to the whole corrupt setup. Jeroboam had solved his political problem. His people no longer needed Jerusalem. They had their own worship sites, their own priests, their own festivals. But he had created a spiritual disaster. He had led the northern kingdom into idolatry from its very first year, and the writer of Kings would repeatedly refer to the sin of Jeroboam as the defining corruption that plagued the northern kingdom until its eventual destruction. The kingdom was divided, but the conflict was just beginning. Rehoboam ruled in Jerusalem over Judah and Benjamin. Jeroboam ruled in Shechem over the 10 northern tribes, and between them was a border that became a battlefield. 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 30 summarizes the ongoing hostility. There was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Not one war, not a single campaign, continual warfare. Year after year, the two kingdoms clashed along their shared border. Raids, skirmishes, territorial disputes, the fighting never really stopped. 2 Chronicles chapter 11 verses 5 through 12 describe how Rehoboam fortified his territory. Rehoboam lived in Jerusalem and built up towns for defense in Judah: Bethlehem, Etam, Tekoa, Bethzur, Soko, Adullam, Gath, Maresha, Ziph, Adoraim, Lachish, Azekah, Zorah, Aijalon, and Hebron. These were fortified cities in Judah and Benjamin. He strengthened their defenses and put commanders in them, with supplies of food, olive oil, and wine. He put shields and spears in all the cities and made them very strong. Notice the locations. Most of these fortified cities faced west toward the Philistines or north toward Israel. Rehoboam was building a defensive perimeter, creating a network of strongholds to protect Judah from invasion. He wasn't preparing for peace. He was preparing for prolonged conflict. The military buildup was extensive. Verse 12 emphasizes the weapon stockpiles in every city. Shields for defense, spears for offense. These weren't token garrisons. These were serious military installations designed to withstand siege and support offensive operations. But something else happened during this time that would actually strengthen Judah. Verses 13 and 14 describe an important migration. The priests and Levites from all their districts throughout Israel sided with him. The Levites even abandoned their pasture lands and property and came to Judah and Jerusalem because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord. The religious divide was hardening. Jeroboam had created his alternative worship system with non-Levitical priests. The real priests and Levites recognized this as illegitimate and moved south. They left their ancestral lands, their homes, their property, everything, to serve in Jerusalem where proper worship continued. This migration strengthened Judah spiritually and demographically. The priests and Levites brought their families, their knowledge, their commitment to God's law. Verse 16 adds, "Those from every tribe of Israel who set their hearts on seeking the Lord, the God of Israel, followed the Levites to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices to the Lord, the God of their ancestors." So it wasn't just religious officials. Regular Israelites who wanted to worship God properly were moving south. Families from the northern tribes were abandoning their homes to live in Judah, where they could worship without the corruption Jeroboam had introduced. Yet even with this spiritual and demographic strength, the warfare continued throughout Rehoboam's entire reign. Neither side could deliver a knockout blow. The border remained contested. Villages changed hands. Soldiers died. Families on both sides buried their sons. Rehoboam's troubles weren't limited to fighting with Israel. In his 5th year as king, a far more dangerous threat came from the south. Egypt saw opportunity in the divided kingdom. 2 Chronicles chapter 12 verse 2 introduces the crisis. Because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem in the 5th year of King Rehoboam. This wasn't a border raid. This was a full-scale invasion by one of the ancient world's great military powers. Verse 3 describes the size of Shishak's army. With 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, and the innumerable troops of Libyans, Sukkites and Cushites that came with him from Egypt. 1,200 chariots was an overwhelming force, 60,000 cavalry added to the shock troops, and the infantry from Libya, Sukkoth and Cush swelled the numbers beyond counting. This army rolled north through Judah like a storm. Verse 4 records the devastation. He captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. All those cities Rehoboam had fortified, Lachish, Azekah, Mareshah, they fell to Shishak's invasion. The shields and spears weren't enough. Egypt was unstoppable. Jerusalem itself came under siege. Rehoboam and his officials gathered in the city, trapped. Then the prophet Shemaiah came to them. Verse 5 records his message. Then the prophet Shemaiah came to Rehoboam and to the leaders of Judah who had assembled in Jerusalem for fear of Shishak. And he said to them, "This is what the Lord says, you have abandoned me. Therefore, I now abandon you to Shishak." The message was harsh, but clear. Judah's unfaithfulness had consequences. Both kingdoms had fallen into idolatry. The north under Jeroboam with his golden calves, the south under Rehoboam with high places and pagan practices. Verse 6 shows the response. The leaders of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, "The Lord is just." They didn't argue, they acknowledged they deserved judgment. Because of this humility, God showed mercy. Verses 7 and 8 record the modified judgment. When the Lord saw that they humbled themselves, this word of the Lord came to Shemaiah. "Since they have humbled themselves, I will not destroy them, but will soon give them deliverance. My wrath will not be poured out on Jerusalem through Shishak. They will, however, become subject to him, so that they may learn the difference between serving me and serving the kings of other lands." God wouldn't destroy Jerusalem, but Judah would pay a heavy price. Verses 9 and 10 describe the cost. When Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem, he carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including the gold shield Solomon had made, so King Rehoboam made bronze shields to replace them and assigned these to the commanders of the guard on duty at the entrance to the royal palace. Everything. The temple treasury that Solomon had filled, gone. The palace wealth, gone. Those magnificent gold shields carried off to Egypt. Rehoboam replaced them with bronze, a cheaper metal, a visible reminder of how far Judah had fallen. Rehoboam died after 17 years, and his son Abijah took the throne. The warfare between Judah and Israel continued, but Abijah wouldn't be content with border skirmishes. He wanted decisive victory. 2 Chronicles chapter 13 verse 3 describes the armies that faced each other. Abijah went into battle with an army of 400,000 able fighting men, and Jeroboam drew up a battle line against him with 800,000 able troops. These numbers are staggering. Jeroboam's army was twice the size of Abijah's. Before the fighting began, Abijah stood on Mount Zemaraim and delivered a speech. He argued that the kingdom belonged to David's line by divine covenant. He attacked Israel's religious corruption, the golden calves, the unauthorized priests, the whole system Jeroboam had created. He contrasted this with Judah's faithfulness to proper worship. But while Abijah talked, Jeroboam maneuvered. Verse 13 describes the tactical situation. Now Jeroboam had sent troops around to the rear, so that while he was in front of Judah, the ambush was behind them. Classic military strategy. Pin the enemy with your main force while a hidden unit circles around. Judah suddenly realized they were surrounded. Verse 14 shows their reaction. Judah turned and saw that they were being attacked at both front and rear. Then they cried out to the Lord. The priests blew their trumpets. Trapped between two forces, outnumbered 2-1, Judah prayed. Verse 15 records what happened next. And the men of Judah raised the battle cry. At the sound of their battle cry, God routed Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. God intervened. The tactical advantage, the numerical superiority, none of it mattered. God gave Judah victory. The defeat wasn't just tactical, it was catastrophic. Verse 17 gives the casualties. Abijah and his army inflicted heavy losses on them, so that there were 500,000 casualties among Israel's able men. 500,000 dead, half of Jeroboam's army destroyed in a single battle. Verse 19 describes Judah's advance. Abijah pursued Jeroboam and took from him the towns of Bethel, Jeshanah, and Ephron with their surrounding villages. Bethel, where one of Jeroboam's golden calves stood, captured by Judah. Strategic towns in Israel's territory now under Abijah's control. Verse 20 records Jeroboam's fate. Jeroboam did not regain power during the time of Abijah, and the Lord struck him down, and he died. The king, who had received 10 tribes through prophecy, died under God's judgment. Abijah's reign ended after just 3 years, and his son Asa took the throne. Where Abijah had focused on military victory, Asa would focus on spiritual renewal. 2 Chronicles chapter 14 verse 1 introduces his reign with an unexpected note. And Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. After Rehoboam's idolatry, finally a king who truly followed God. Verses 2 and 3 describe his reforms. He removed the foreign altars and the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and to obey his laws and commands. This wasn't token reform. Asa was dismantling the idolatrous infrastructure. The result was peace. Verse 5 states, "And the kingdom was at peace under him." After decades of constant warfare, Judah finally had rest. Not because of superior military strength, but because of spiritual obedience. Verse 6 describes what Asa did with this peace. He built up the fortified cities of Judah, since the land was at peace. No one was at war with him during those years, for the Lord gave him rest. He didn't waste the peaceful years. He strengthened defenses, rebuilt walls. Asa also built a strong military. Verse 8 describes his army. Asa had an army of 300,000 men from Judah, equipped with large shields and with spears, and 280,000 from Benjamin, armed with small shields and with bows. All these were brave fighting men. 1 Kings chapter 15 verse 13 shows Asa's reforms didn't spare his own family. He even deposed his grandmother Maacah from her position as queen mother because she had made a repulsive image for the worship of Asherah. Asa cut it down and burned it in the Kidron Valley. Removing the queen mother took courage, but Asa valued faithfulness over family loyalty. The peace lasted 10 years, 10 years to build and strengthen, 10 years to worship without corruption. But a test was coming. The 10th year brought the peace to a sudden end. 2 Chronicles chapter 14 verse 9 introduces the crisis. Zerah the Cushite marched out against them with an army of thousands upon thousands and 300 chariots, and came as far as Mareshah, 1,000,000 men. This was an overwhelming force that could destroy Judah completely. Verse 10 shows Asa's response. Asa went out to meet him, and they took up battle positions in the valley of Zephathah near Mareshah. Asa didn't hide behind Jerusalem's walls. He marched out to face an enemy that outnumbered him catastrophically. Before the battle began, Asa prayed. Verse 11 records his words. Then Asa called the mighty, "Help us, Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this vast army. Lord, you are our God. Do not let mere mortals prevail against you." This prayer shows Asa's faith. He acknowledged Judah's weakness. He recognized God as their only hope. He framed the battle theologically. This was God's reputation on the line. The answer came immediately. Verse 12 states, "The Lord struck down the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The Cushites fled. God intervened directly. The massive army broke and ran." Verse 13 describes the pursuit. "And Asa and his army pursued them as far as Gerar. Such a great number of Cushites fell that they could not recover. They were crushed before the Lord and his forces. The men of Judah carried off a large amount of plunder. The victory was total. The Ethiopian army was destroyed completely. This victory was even more miraculous than Mount Zemaraim. Asa faced odds that should have meant certain annihilation, but God delivered. The lesson was clear. Faithfulness mattered more than military odds. The peace that followed lasted for years. But in Asa's 36th year, a new threat emerged from the north. 2 Chronicles chapter 16 verse 1 describes the problem. In the 36th year of Asa's reign, Baasha king of Israel went up against Judah and fortified Ramah to prevent anyone from leaving or entering the territory of Asa king of Judah. Ramah was only 5 miles north of Jerusalem. Baasha had built a fortress on Judah's doorstep, cutting off the northern approach to the capital. This was a blockade threatening to isolate and weaken Judah economically. Asa could have trusted God as he had against the Ethiopians. Instead, he chose diplomacy. Verses 2 and 3 describe his solution. Asa then took the silver and gold out of the treasuries of the Lord's temple and of his own palace, and sent it to Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, who was ruling in Damascus. "Let there be a treaty between me and you," he said, "as there was between my father and your father. See, I am sending you silver and gold. Now break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so he will withdraw from me." Asa stripped the temple treasury to bribe Damascus to attack Israel. The plan worked. Verse 4 shows, Ben-Hadad agreed with King Asa and sent the commanders of his forces against the towns of Israel. They conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel-maim, and all the store cities of Naphtali. Verse 5 states, "When Baasha heard this, he stopped building Ramah and abandoned his work." The blockade ended. Asa had neutralized the threat without fighting, but he had relied on Damascus instead of God. Asa's political solution had worked perfectly from a human perspective, but success in human terms doesn't always mean approval from God. Verse 7 introduces the prophet Hanani. At that time, Hanani the seer came to Asa king of Judah and said to him, "Because you relied on the king of Aram and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Aram has escaped from your hand." Hanani reminded Asa of his past victory. Verse 8 says, "Were not the Cushites and Libyans a mighty army with great numbers of chariots and horsemen? Yet when you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. You defeated a 1,000,000-man army by trusting God. But facing a fortification project, you trusted Damascus instead. The prophet delivered the consequence. You have done a foolish thing, and from now on, you will be at war." Peace was over. If Asa had trusted God, he could have gained victory over both Israel and Damascus. His political cleverness had actually cost him a greater victory. Asa's response revealed how much he had changed. Verse 10 describes his reaction. Asa was angry with the seer because of this. He was so enraged that he put him in prison. At the same time, Asa brutally oppressed some of the people. This wasn't the Asa who had prayed humbly before the Ethiopians. This was a king who imprisoned prophets for speaking truth, who turned his rage on his own people. Success had made him self-reliant. Verse 12 shows this pattern continued. In the 39th year of his reign, Asa was afflicted with a disease in his feet. Though his disease was severe, even in his illness, he did not seek help from the Lord, but only from the physicians. Even facing death, Asa looked to human solutions rather than divine help. The confrontation between Hanani and Asa illustrates how spiritual compromise affects everything. Asa hadn't abandoned worship of God completely. From the outside, he probably still looked like a godly king, but his heart had shifted from dependence on God to confidence in his own political skill. When Hanani delivered God's message, he wasn't just criticizing a policy decision. He was diagnosing a spiritual condition. The issue was what Asa's actions revealed about his faith. And Hanani's words exposed that Asa's heart was no longer fully committed to God. The prophet's rebuke hit Asa in a vulnerable spot: pride. Asa had successfully managed the crisis. His plan had worked. Judah was safe. And then a prophet showed up to say it was foolish, that it revealed lack of faith, that it would have negative consequences. That message is hard to hear even for humble people. For someone whose pride had grown during decades of successful reign, it was intolerable. Asa's imprisonment of Hanani revealed the transformation in his character. The young king who had sought God's will now silenced God's messenger. The reformer who had removed corruption now became an oppressor. The leader who had trusted God against impossible odds now trusted political alliances and responded to criticism with violence. The brutal oppression of some of the people suggests Hanani wasn't the only one who felt Asa's wrath. Perhaps others had agreed with the prophet. Perhaps some had questioned the wisdom of bribing Damascus. Asa dealt with dissent through force. This is what happens when leaders surround themselves with yes men and silence prophetic voices. Asa had become the kind of king who couldn't tolerate challenge, who saw truth-telling as rebellion, who used power to crush opposition. The foot disease that struck Asa 3 years later could have been another opportunity for repentance. But Asa's heart had hardened. Even facing a disease that would eventually kill him, he looked to physicians, but not to God. There's nothing wrong with using physicians, but the issue was Asa's heart. He had replaced dependence on God with dependence on human wisdom. Verse 13 records the end. Then in the 41st year of his reign, Asa died and rested with his ancestors. He reigned 41 years total. The first 35 were marked by faithfulness, reform, peace, and miraculous victory. The last 6 were marked by compromise, anger, oppression, and disease. Asa started well, but finished poorly, leaving both his achievements and his failures as warnings for the generations that would follow. Asa died, and his son Jehoshaphat became king of Judah. Unlike his father's troubled final years, Jehoshaphat started strong and stayed strong spiritually. He would become one of Judah's most faithful kings. 2 Chronicles chapter 17 verse 3 introduces his character. The Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he followed the ways of his father David before him. He did not consult the Baals. Notice the comparison, not Asa, but David. Jehoshaphat was reaching back to the spiritual standard set by Israel's greatest king. Verse 4 emphasizes his commitment, but sought the God of his father and followed his commands rather than the practices of Israel. This was a direct contrast with the northern kingdom. While Israel followed Jeroboam's corrupt worship system, Jehoshaphat pursued genuine faithfulness to God. He didn't just practice personal piety, he actively worked to spread knowledge of God's law throughout the kingdom. Verses 7 through 9 describe an organized teaching mission. In the 3rd year of his reign, he sent his officials Ben-Hail, Obadiah, Zechariah, Nethanel, and Micaiah to teach in the towns of Judah. With them were certain Levites, Shemaiah, Nethaniah, Zebediah, Asahel, Shemiramoth, Jehonathan, Adonijah, Tobijah, and Tobadonijah, and the priests Elishama and Jehoram. They taught throughout Judah, taking with them the book of the law of the Lord. They went around to all the towns of Judah and taught the people. This was systematic spiritual education. Jehoshaphat sent officials, Levites, and priests on a teaching circuit through every town in Judah. They carried the book of the law with them, teaching people what God actually required. This wasn't just reform, it was revival. The results were remarkable. Verse 10 describes the impact. The fear of the Lord fell on all the kingdoms of the lands surrounding Judah, so that they did not go to war against Jehoshaphat. Surrounding nations recognized that God was with Judah. They didn't dare attack. Instead, they brought tribute. Verse 12 states, Jehoshaphat became more and more powerful. He built forts and store cities in Judah. He was building infrastructure, creating defensive positions. The kingdom was growing stronger every year. His military was impressive, with commanders leading hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers throughout the kingdom. Jehoshaphat decided to make peace with Israel. After decades of hostility between the two kingdoms, this seemed like wise diplomacy. But the method he chose would prove disastrous. 2 Chronicles chapter 18 verse 1 records the alliance. Now Jehoshaphat had great wealth and honor, and he allied himself with Ahab by marriage. Marriage alliance. This was how ancient kings sealed treaties, but this wasn't just any marriage. This was marriage with Ahab's family. Ahab was the most wicked king Israel had ever seen. 1 Kings chapter 16 verse 30 states, Ahab son of Omri did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. Worse than Jeroboam, worse than all the corrupt kings who had ruled Israel since the division. Verse 31 describes his marriage. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. Jezebel, the name that would become synonymous with evil. This was the family Jehoshaphat chose to marry into. The arrangement was for Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram, to marry Ahab's daughter, Athaliah. One marriage connecting two dynasties, linking the godly line of David with the most corrupt royal house in Israel's history. 2 Kings chapter 8 verse 18 records the consequence. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for he married a daughter of Ahab. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This verse is about Jehoram, Jehoshaphat's son. The marriage to Athaliah would corrupt him completely. Athaliah was Jezebel's daughter. She had learned from her mother. When she came to Judah, she brought Baal worship with her. The idolatry that Jehoshaphat had worked so hard to eliminate would come roaring back through his own daughter-in-law. Think about what Jehoshaphat had done. He had sent teachers throughout Judah with the book of the law. He had built a spiritual revival. And then he voluntarily imported corruption by marrying his son to Jezebel's daughter. The alliance seemed brilliant politically. It ended the warfare between Judah and Israel, but spiritually it was poison. Years after Ahab's death, his son Jehoram became king of Israel. Moab, which had been paying tribute to Israel, rebelled. Jehoram decided to crush the rebellion and asked Jehoshaphat to join him. 2 Kings chapter 3 verse 7 records the invitation. He also sent this message to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight against Moab? I will go with you, he replied. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. Jehoshaphat's answer showed how deep the alliance had become. I am as you are. Complete identification with Israel. No hesitation. No consulting God first. Just immediate agreement to join Israel's military campaign. The plan involved going through Edom. The king of Edom joined the coalition, making it 3 kingdoms against Moab. But the desert route created a problem. Verse 9 states, after a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for the animals with them. They were dying of thirst in the wilderness. Jehoshaphat asked for a prophet. They found Elisha. Verse 14 shows Elisha's response. Elisha said, as surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I did not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not pay any attention to you. The only reason Elisha was willing to help was because of Jehoshaphat. The prophet called for a harpist and prophesied. Verses 16 and 17 contain God's instructions. This is what the Lord says, I will fill this valley with pools of water. For this is what the Lord says, you will see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle and your other animals will drink. But God didn't stop with just providing water. Verse 18 adds, this is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. He will also deliver Moab into your hands. The prophecy came true exactly. Water appeared in the desert. The Moabites saw it from a distance and thought it was blood, assuming the 3 kings had fought each other. They rushed forward expecting to loot corpses. Instead, they ran into 3 prepared armies and were slaughtered. The coalition won a complete victory, but only for Jehoshaphat's sake. Earlier in Jehoshaphat's reign, there had been another joint military operation that ended in catastrophe. This one involved Ahab himself. 2 Chronicles chapter 18 verse 2 describes how it started. Some years later he went down to see Ahab in Samaria. Ahab slaughtered many sheep and cattle for him and the people with him and urged him to attack Ramoth-Gilead. Ahab hosted Jehoshaphat with lavish hospitality, then proposed a joint campaign. Verse 3 shows Jehoshaphat's response. Ahab, king of Israel, asked Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, will you go with me against Ramoth-Gilead? Jehoshaphat replied, I am as you are, and my people as your people. We will join you in the war. Again, immediate agreement. But then Jehoshaphat added, first seek the counsel of the Lord. Ahab assembled 400 prophets who all promised victory. But Jehoshaphat wasn't satisfied. He sensed something was wrong. Ahab admitted there was one more prophet. Verse 7 records, the king of Israel answered Jehoshaphat, there is still one prophet through whom we can inquire of the Lord, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah. They sent for Micaiah. When pressed to tell the truth, he delivered a devastating prophecy. Verses 16 and 17 contain his vision. Then Micaiah answered, I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd. And the Lord said, these people have no master. Let each one go home in peace. Ahab would die in this battle. Ahab's response was to imprison Micaiah. Then he came up with a plan. Verse 29 describes, the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will enter the battle in disguise, but you wear your royal robes. He was using Jehoshaphat as a decoy. The Syrian king had ordered his commanders to target only Ahab. Verse 31 shows what happened. When the chariot commanders saw Jehoshaphat, they thought, this is the king of Israel. So they turned to attack him, but Jehoshaphat cried out, and the Lord helped him. God drew them away from him. Jehoshaphat barely escaped, but Ahab's disguise didn't save him. Verse 33 records, but someone drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel between the sections of his armor. A random arrow found the gap in Ahab's armor. By evening, he was dead. Micaiah's prophecy came true. When Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem after the Ramoth-Gilead disaster, a prophet was waiting for him. This would be a direct confrontation about Jehoshaphat's dangerous alliances. 2 Chronicles chapter 19 verse 2 introduces the prophet Jehu. Jehu the seer, the son of Hanani, went out to meet him and said to the king, "Should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Because of this, the wrath of the Lord is on you." The message was blunt. Why are you helping wicked people? Why are you loving God's enemies? Jehu was Hanani's son, the same Hanani that Asa had imprisoned. Now Hanani's son was delivering a similar rebuke to Asa's grandson. The prophetic ministry continued across generations. Jehu's accusation was serious. The wrath of the Lord is on you. Jehoshaphat's alliance with Ahab had brought divine anger. He had nearly died at Ramoth-Gilead, and that was just the beginning of the consequences. But Jehu didn't only condemn. Verse 3 acknowledged, "There is, however, some good in you, for you have rid the land of the Asherah poles, and have set your heart on seeking God." The prophet recognized Jehoshaphat's spiritual reforms, but that didn't excuse his compromises. Jehoshaphat's response was different from Asa's. Verse 4 shows, "Jehoshaphat lived in Jerusalem, and he went out again among the people from Beersheba to the hill country of Ephraim, and turned them back to the Lord, the God of their ancestors." Instead of getting defensive, Jehoshaphat doubled down on faithfulness. He also reformed the justice system. Verses 5 through 7 describe judicial appointments throughout the kingdom. He established courts in every fortified city and created an appellate system in Jerusalem. He gave clear instructions about impartiality and fearing God. Jehoshaphat responded to prophetic rebuke with renewed obedience. He accepted correction and intensified his reforms. But the pattern of making alliances with wicked kings would continue. Sometime later, Jehoshaphat faced a crisis that would test his faith more severely than any battle. A massive coalition of enemies was marching toward Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 1 introduces the threat. After this, the Moabites and Ammonites with some of the Meunites came to wage war against Jehoshaphat. This was a coalition, Moab, Ammon, and fighters from Meun joining forces against Judah. Verse 2 describes the news. Some people came and told Jehoshaphat, "A vast army is coming against you from Edom, from the other side of the Dead Sea. It is already in Hazezon Tamar," that is, En-Gedi. The enemy was already deep in Judah's territory, only about 20 miles from Jerusalem. Verse 3 shows Jehoshaphat's reaction. Alarmed, Jehoshaphat resolved to inquire of the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast for all Judah. He didn't mobilize the army first. He didn't send messengers to make alliances. He proclaimed a fast and turned to God. Verse 4 describes the response. The people of Judah came together to seek help from the Lord. Indeed, they came from every town in Judah to seek him. And as this was national prayer, the entire nation was seeking God together. Jehoshaphat stood in the temple court and prayed publicly. Verses 6 through 9 record his prayer, rehearsing history, acknowledging God's sovereignty, reminding God of his promises to Abraham and the dedication of the temple. Then he described the current crisis and concluded in verse 12, "Our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." Complete honesty, complete dependence. We're powerless, we have no strategy. We're looking to you alone. This was the faith God was looking for. While all Judah stood before the Lord waiting for an answer, the Spirit of God came upon a Levite in the assembly. 2 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 14 introduces the prophet. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Jahaziel, son of Zechariah, the son of Benaiah, the son of Jael, the son of Mattaniah, a Levite and descendant of Asaph, as he stood in the assembly. A worship leader, not a warrior, a Levite from Asaph's line, the family of temple singers. Verse 15 contains the prophecy. He said, "Listen, King Jehoshaphat and all who live in Judah and Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says to you. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's." Verse 17 contains the shocking command. You will not have to fight this battle. Take up your positions, stand firm, and see the deliverance the Lord will give you, Judah and Jerusalem. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Go out to face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. Don't fight. Just stand there, watch. Verse 18 shows the response. Jehoshaphat bowed down with his face to the ground, and all the people of Judah and Jerusalem fell down in worship before the Lord. Before the battle, before seeing any evidence, they worshipped in faith. The next morning came the most unusual military formation in history. Verse 21 describes, after consulting the people, Jehoshaphat appointed men to sing to the Lord and to praise him for the splendor of his holiness as they went out at the head of the army, saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever." The worship team marched in front of the army, singing praise. Verse 22 reveals what happened. As they began to sing and praise, the Lord set ambushes against the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir who were invading Judah, and they were defeated. Verse 23 describes the confusion. The Ammonites and Moabites rose up against the men from Mount Seir to destroy and annihilate them. After they finished slaughtering the men from Seir, they helped to destroy one another. The vast army destroyed itself. Verse 24 shows what Judah saw. When the men of Judah came to the place that overlooks the desert and looked toward the vast army, they saw only dead bodies lying on the ground. No one had escaped. The plunder took 3 days to collect. Verse 26 records, on the 4th day they assembled in the valley of Berakah, where they praised the Lord. They named the location to commemorate what God had done. After experiencing such a miraculous victory, you would think Jehoshaphat had learned his lesson about making alliances. But near the end of his reign, he made one more partnership with Israel's wicked kings. 1 Kings chapter 22 verse 48 introduces, "Now Jehoshaphat built a fleet of trading ships to go to Ophir for gold, but they never set sail. They were wrecked at Etzion-Geber." Jehoshaphat was building a trading fleet for gold from Ophir, but he didn't do it alone. 2 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 35 gives context. Later, Jehoshaphat king of Judah made an alliance with Ahaziah king of Israel, whose ways were wicked. Ahaziah was Ahab's son, another king from that corrupt dynasty. Verse 36 describes, he agreed with him to construct a fleet of trading ships. After these were built at Etzion-Geber, this was a joint commercial venture. From a business perspective, this made sense. Pooling resources, sharing costs. It seemed like smart economics. But God sent a prophet. Verse 37 records, Eliezer son of Dodavahu of Maresha prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, "Because you have made an alliance with Ahaziah, the Lord will destroy what you have made." The ships were wrecked and were not able to set sail to trade. The destruction wasn't natural disaster. God himself was destroying the fleet because of the alliance. The partnership with wickedness meant the venture was doomed from the start. 1 Kings chapter 22 verse 49 adds, "At that time, Ahaziah son of Ahab said to Jehoshaphat, 'Let my men sail with yours.' But Jehoshaphat refused. After the ships were destroyed, Ahaziah wanted to try again, but this time Jehoshaphat said no. The maritime alliance showed Jehoshaphat's persistent blind spot. He was faithful in worship. He promoted God's law. He sought prophetic guidance in crises. But when it came to making alliances with Israel's kings, he repeatedly compromised. 2 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 1 records, "Then Jehoshaphat rested with his ancestors and was buried with them in the city of David. And Jehoram his son succeeded him as king." Jehoshaphat was gone. His son Jehoram married to Athaliah, daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, took the throne. The consequences of Jehoshaphat's marriage alliance would now become clear. If this deep dive into biblical history opened your eyes to the complexity and tragedy of Israel and Judah's conflict, subscribe to this channel for more in-depth explorations of Scripture's most compelling stories. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how compromise costs everything, and let us know in the comments which king's story impacted you the most. The kingdoms fell, the walls crumbled, the armies scattered,